Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm so happy to welcome you to the first session of our Spring Monday lecture series, which is called The Space in Between, Thresholds and Borders in Jewish Life and Thought. So we'll be going from today through most of May, just missing the couple days that are holidays. And we really look forward to learning with you. And I want to especially welcome anyone who might be joining us for the first time. We're so pleased that Professor Benjamin Sommer, Professor of Bible and Ancient Semitic Languages, is going to be kicking us off today with the new series. And his session is entitled The World as Liminal, Genesis and the Incompleteness of Creation. Before we begin the session and just share a few administrative announcements, I just wanted to say a word about where the idea for this series came from. The first lecture series that we started in the early days of the pandemic in April 2020, the theme was times of crisis and possibility. And our goal there was perhaps obviously to kind of speak to the moment, respond to the sense of crisis that everyone was in. And we also wanted to kind of derive a sense of perhaps comfort and ideally guidance from Jewish sources based on the fact that this was not the first crisis that the Jewish world or the world of human beings had seen before. And I think that we had a tremendous response to that series. And I think that part of that was because it was responding to where people were at. And I think that people were kind of getting a sense of not normalizing, because what we were dealing with was not normal, of course, but seeing the crisis that we were in as part of a context that we could trace over the sweep of Jewish history. So this series came a little bit from that paradigm that we're in this in-between space. It's not, we are certainly not where we were in 2020. And yet, our relationships, our institutions, the patterns of our daily lives, nothing has just kind of, bounced back to where it was pre-pandemic. And I think a lot of people and again, institutions have this sense of like, where are we going? We don't know exactly what things are going to look like. And we were sort of tapping into to the fact that maybe we often feel that way in life. Sometimes, it feels like a whole generation might be in an in-between phase, or we might be geographically located in an in-between place. Our identities might be in between multiple things, rituals that feel like they're sort of in between. So that's what motivated this series, that sense of where are we and what are we in between. And we were looking at a whole variety of instances in Jewish thought and Jewish practice and Jewish text that kind of zoom in on that in-between place. So that's I just wanted to give that framing of today and of the series as we begin today. And Professor Sommer will, I'm sure, share a little bit more about this this liminal space, the in-between. And I heard from a few people that they thought this series was maybe on the esoteric side. So that's why I wanted to share that introduction and kind of share where we're coming from. All right, so as we begin, I first wanted to thank our sponsor for today's session, JTS trustee Yael Aspel. Yael, thank you so much for your ongoing support and for sponsoring today at the Navi level. And I know that you hope that your sponsorship will inspire other people to sponsor as well. And of course we do too. So on that note, if anyone else is feeling inspired by this amazing opportunity to learn with JTS's outstanding faculty, we would love for you to partner with us by sponsoring a session. We have 3 sponsorship levels: Chacham for $540, Tzaddik for $1,000, and Navi for $1,800. You can sponsor individually, you can sponsor as a group, you can sponsor in honor of someone, in memory. Please feel free to be in touch with us for more information about that. And Tani has put information into the chat. And I will now turn it over to Tani to share some additional information.
Thank you, Rabbi Endelman. We're really excited to be back learning together after a few-week hiatus. Just to go over the format for our session, Professor Sommer will pause for questions periodically throughout the class, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Endelman during the Q&A period. Rabbi Endelman will select a few of the questions to present to Professor Sommer. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received earlier today, and we'll be screen sharing them as well. We'll also share a link shortly in the chat. And we're so pleased to have Professor Benjamin Sommer leading us in the first session of the series. Professor Sommer joined the JTS faculty as Professor of Bible in 2008. He has written several books, which have been the recipients of multiple awards and prizes. His most recent book is Revelation and Authorities, Sinai in Jewish Scripture and Tradition. You can read more about his publications in the full bio with the sources. Dr. Sommer has long been active as a lecturer and scholar in residence, teaching rabbis, Jewish educators, and lay people in a variety of settings in the United States and in Israel. And I'm so pleased to turn it over to Professor Sommer.
Thank you. Thank you, Tani and Julia. And thank you especially to Yael, who actually I think is not here today. I think he's going to be watching this, watching the recording because he has something else going on at the moment. So you'll see this tomorrow. But hello, Yael, and thank you very much. It is, as always, just delightful to look through these little boxes on my screen and to see so many familiar faces and so many familiar names. Not only around the country, but I see in Israel as well. Welcome back. It's wonderful to be giving the first class in this series of lectures on the space in between. Let me say a few things actually about that theme more generally, and why scholars of religion are so very, very interesting in this theme of the space in between. The title that scholars of religion and anthropologists use for this idea is the term that is often used is liminality. Liminality, that is, in fact, in the description of the series, probably all of you read that according to the description in this series, JTS scholars will delve into the idea of liminality, the time or space in between, which we encounter often in Jewish ritual, identity, law, and life. Scholars of religion love talking about liminality and have loved talking about liminality now for a good probably 60 or 70 years. An anthropologist of religion named Arnold van Gennep was the first anthropologist to use this term and to talk about how rituals often put the ritual participants, the people performing the rituals, into this in-between state. And then another anthropologist named Victor Turner picked up this idea. It's especially through Victor Turner's work that the idea of the liminal in ritual, this in-between state in ritual processes, became a major idea in the anthropology of religion and the study of comparative religion. Both of these anthropologists, Van Gennep and Turner, talked about how rituals often mark a change, a transformation, or even they effectuate, they bring about a change or a transformation. You can see this if you think about rituals in a person's life cycle. We have rituals in Judaism, let's say the bar mitzvah or the bat mitzvah, when one is moving from childhood to a greater sense of a greater state of responsibility. Marriage is another such ritual. Brit and naming ceremonies. all religions, all cultures have these rituals that mark a transformation or effectuate a transformation from one state to another. That's also the case not only for individuals' life cycle rituals, it's also the case for communal rituals which go on over the course of a year. So a New Year's festival, for example, brings us from one time to another time. And in the ritual itself, we're in this sort of in-between state. When you're in that in-between state in the ritual itself, these anthropologists suggest it's often the case in cultures around the world that during the ritual itself, one finds oneself neither here nor there. There's a moment in which one is, let's say, neither a child nor an adult, or there's a moment in which we're not in this year, but we're not into the next year either. And during that in-between time, which Van Gennep and then Turner and then lots of other scholars refer to as the liminal moment or the liminal state, during that in-between time, there's an absence of structure. There's an absence of structure. There's no boundaries. There's no guardrails. The structure that being a child or being in this particular year or being in this particular state gives you, that structure is gone. And when there's no structure, when there are no boundaries, no guardrails, that means that a person or a community, on the one hand, has a great deal of freedom. In the absence of structure, there's complete freedom. But on the other hand, a person or a community is also in great danger. Without those boundaries, without those guardrails, one is also in a situation of danger. And these anthropologists talk about how one can see from the way that rituals are enacted that there's a sense of both freedom and danger in this state, in the state of being liminal. Now, once scholars realized that this was so characteristic of ritual, scholars began to realize that, well, this idea of the liminal, this idea of being at a moment or in a place without structure, without boundaries, without guardrails, in a place that is both full of freedom but full of danger, we can see that in lots of other realms of human culture and especially of religion. Not only do we see this in ritual, we might see this in narrative. There might be stories or myths that portray a liminal space, literally a liminal place, or a liminal time. There are institutions that themselves are neither here nor there. There might be people who don't fit into a particular category, who are liminal people. And so the liminality, you might say, becomes a major theme, a sort of something of an industry within religious studies. What we'll be doing in this series is looking at examples of places, people, institutions, texts that either are themselves neither here nor there, or that portray a situation that is neither here nor there. In particular, in my talk today, I'm going to be talking about liminality really on a very, very large scale. I'm going to be talking about the idea that the Bible regards creation itself as being liminal. The Bible regards the world that is created in Genesis chapter 1 as liminal, as existing between chaos and order. So that'll be our theme for today. We're going to be talking about the idea, especially in Genesis chapter 1, of creation itself as being betwixt and between, neither quite here nor quite there. Liminality doesn't get really bigger than that, the idea that everything is liminal. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Genesis chapter 1. Actually, I wonder, Julia or Tanya, we didn't say anything about the way we'll be doing questions. Do you want to just say a thing about that? And I actually just have to close something over on my left. So Julia or Tanya, do you want to say something about how in the chat we'll be doing the questions at about the 20-minute mark or so, and then again 20 minutes later?
So that's the time frame. And as Tani mentioned, we invite you to send any questions for Professor Sommer to me via the chat, to Rabbi Julia Andelman. And if you have technical questions about Zoom or volume or any screen sharing, anything like that, you can send those to Tani or to Ellie Gettinger. But questions for Professor Sommer can send to me, and we'll periodically stop for questions.
So I'd like to begin by responding to a question that some of you may already have. I just said that the creation of the world as portrayed by Genesis chapter 1 is one in which the world itself is unfinished. The world that God creates is not quite perfect, but is incomplete and therefore is liminal, is between chaos and order. And some of you might be wondering, having no doubt read Genesis chapter 1, why do I say that Genesis chapter 1 portrays the world at the end of the story as liminal, as existing between chaos and order? You might be thinking, but Genesis 1 is full of order. It's full of structure. Genesis 1 is all about the imposition of structure on chaos. From the very beginning, starting with Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, what God does to create the world is not so much make something where there was nothing. Genesis 1 doesn't portray creation ex nihilo, bria yesh me'ayin. It doesn't portray God as creating matter. Matter's already there at the very beginning of Genesis 1, but it's a complete mess. Everything is mixed together. So what God does in Genesis 1 is God sets up structures. God takes things and puts them in different places so that this world of chaos becomes what seems to be a world of order. God separates light from dark, so that we have day and then we have night. God goes on to separate the waters below from waters above. A world that had been full of, let's say, some sort of moist mixture of matter and water becomes a world in which there's water below, that is the oceans, and water above, the waters above that the ancients believed that were sort of above that blue stuff that we see during the daytime when we look up into the sky. And then God separates below between the areas where the waters gather, those will be the oceans or the seas, and the places where there are dry land. And this process of division, of creating structure, of separating, goes on through the rest of the chapter. So in that sense, Genesis 1 seems to be all about achieving structure, achieving order, and leaving a liminal state. In fact, that's the case not only in terms of the plot of Genesis chapter 1, it's even the case in terms of the writing. The writing in Genesis 1 is itself full of structure. Genesis 1's writing establishes a pattern at the very beginning of the chapter, in the first, really in the first 3 verses, and then that pattern is followed and becomes more elaborate as we go further into the chapter. What I mean is we see already in the first 3 verses of Genesis chapter 1 that God says something, and by saying something, God creates something or separates something. God creates some structure. Then God sees that something and sees that it is good. And then we get the phrase, Vayhi erev, vayhi voker, yom mashahu. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day or the second day, the third day. That structure of God says something and creates order, God sees something, and then we have evening and morning the next day. That goes on throughout the entire chapter. So even the prose of Genesis chapter 1 is full of order. Why is it then that I suggest that Genesis chapter 1, in fact, portrays a world that is liminal, is in between chaos and structure, but hasn't fully arrived at a place of structure? To understand this, it will be necessary for us to try to read Bereshit Perek Aleph, Genesis chapter 1, within its own cultural setting, which is what modern Bible scholars such as myself really do for a living. We're always trying to look at the Bible within its own cultural settings, which is to say within the cultural settings of the ancient Near East. When we look at Genesis chapter 1, alongside other literature from that particular time and place, other literature from the Iron Age, from the Bronze Age in the ancient Near East, when we read literature from the neighbors of the ancient Israelites, we find that something else becomes clear in Genesis chapter 1, that Genesis chapter 1 describes a creation that doesn't ever get completed. that within Genesis chapter 1, within that first creation story, creation never gets to where it's supposed to go. Creation doesn't get to where we expect it to go. And by the way, let me just add real quickly, when I keep on saying Genesis chapter 1 as a reference to that first creation story that we get at the beginning of the Torah, I'm really talking about the first Aliyah more than the first chapter of Genesis. I'm really talking about Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4. That's really the first narrative unit of the Torah. The English bishop in France, who worked in France in the 13th century, Robert, I'm suddenly blanking on his name. His first name is Robert, and I'm forgetting his last name. The English bishop who created the system of chapters that we use to refer to biblical texts, which is actually not a Jewish system originally, for some reason ended chapter 1 a little bit too early. He ended chapter 1 at the end of day 6 instead of at the end of day 7. But really all Bible scholars, Jewish and Christian, nowadays agree that, in fact, the first creation story goes through chapter 2, verse 4. So when I say Genesis 1, that's really what I'm talking about, Genesis 1 through 2, verse 4. When we look at that story, when we look at that narrative, it turns out that that narrative is extremely typical of an ancient Near Eastern creation story. We have archaeologists have dug up in the last century or a century and a half quite a number of ancient creation myths from the peoples who were the Israelites' neighbors, from the Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, the Canaanites, and the Egyptians. And when we look at creation myths of these different peoples, we notice that they follow certain patterns, and Genesis chapter 1 fits into those patterns. Genesis chapter 1, in some respects, is a very typical creation myth from the ancient Near East. And most especially, Genesis chapter 1 has a great deal in common with a very widely disseminated creation text from the ancient Near East, a text from ancient Babylonia that was known as Enuma Elish, which described the beginnings of the world and how ultimately a god named Marduk, who was the god of the city of Babylon and the god of the Babylonian Empire, how Marduk became the king of the gods by leading the various gods and goddesses in a war against the forces of chaos, which was another group of gods, defeating them. And then Marduk is acclaimed as king, and Marduk establishes order within the universe. The universe had already existed before, but it was full of chaos. Having subdued chaos, Marduk creates the world as we know it, creates human beings, creates a number of other things that we'll talk about in a moment. That particular creation story, known as Enuma Elish, was very well known in the ancient Near East. It was almost certainly known to the Kohanim, the priests who wrote much of the Torah, who wrote especially Genesis chapter 1. And when we take a look at Genesis chapter 1, we can see all sorts of points of contact between that priestly story of creation from the Torah and the stories of creation from the ancient Near East, in particular Enuma Elish. So I'd like to go now to the handout. We're going to do a screen share, I think, and we'll bring up the handout. Some of you might have the handout on your own. We'll be, if you'd rather just look at if you've printed it out, we're on page 1. I'd like, first of all, to start off by talking about just the way that Genesis chapter 1 begins, how the phrasing of Genesis chapter 1 begins, and how that phrasing resembles phrasing that we find in Enuma Elish, as well as one other ancient Babylonian creation text. So if you look at the top of page 1, I've actually translated for you the opening lines of Enuma Elish. If you happen to be curious, I've got the original on the right side. The original of this Babylonian creation text is written in a language called Akkadian. Akkadian was the ancient Semitic language spoken both by the Babylonians and the Assyrians. And on the left side, I've got my own translation of those opening lines. I'd like to read through these opening lines. Basically, I want to read through the first sentence of Enuma Elish. And if you, as I'm doing that, if you could try to pay attention to the sentence structure. As I like telling my students, all serious theology comes down to grammar. If you're reading a sacred text and you pay attention to the grammar, you'll create a solid foundation and you'll be able to figure everything else out. So as I'm doing this, let's pretend that we're back in 7th grade diagramming sentences. For those of us who are old enough to have gone to school back when grammar schools actually taught grammar, and think about the structure of this sentence. The text begins with the words Enuma Elish, which means at the time when. At the time when, up there, sky had not been named. And down here, stable earth had not been called by any term. And Apsu, that's the name of the god of fresh waters, the primeval one, the progenitor, and Tiamat, that's the name of the goddess of salt water of the oceans, and Tiamat, the creator who gave birth to all, had mixed their waters together, but neither pastures nor thickets had been formed. At the time when no gods had been brought forth, none was called by name, no destinies were decreed. Gods were born within them. Lachmu and Lachamu were brought forth, were called by name. Now, what happens after this is that other generations of gods then begin to emerge as well. Tiamat and Apsu have children, Lachmu and Lachamu. Then there are grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and we get several generations of gods until we get to the god Marduk. But what I'm interested in here actually isn't so much the plot, but the sentence structure. This sentence is basically a three-part, the basic structure has three parts. There is a when clause, or a relative clause, or a temporal clause, which begins with the word enuma, at the time when. At the time when something was going on. Then we get sort of a parenthetical clause, a long set of parenthetical clauses that describe what things were like back then. Apsu was there, Tiamat was there, they mixed their waters together, but nothing else was there. There were no thickets, there were no pastures. So we get at the time when, then we get a parenthesis describing what things were like. Then we actually repeat that. We again get, this is sort of over further to the left, a second line that begins at the time when, and then we get another parenthetical clause. And then finally, we get the main clause, gods were born within them. So the basic structure here is when, and a clause, then a parenthetical clause, and third, the main clause. In fact, in this case, it's a when clause, a parenthesis, another when clause, and a parenthesis, and then the main clause. We see the exact same structure, the exact same sentence structure in the opening lines of another Babylonian creation myth known as Atrahasis. In the middle of page 1, I'll read that one out loud. At the times when the gods were human. Now, what does it mean to say that the gods were human? Now we get a parenthetical clause explaining what things were like back then. They did the labor, they bore the workload. Great was the workload of the gods. The labor was heavy, the drudgery too much. Then, now we get the main clause. The great Anunnaki, who are higher ranking gods, forced the Igigi, who are lower ranking gods, to bear a sevenfold workload. It's that same structure, a when clause beginning with enuma, at the time when, then a parenthetical clause, which I've indented a little bit. The 3 lines of the parenthetical clause are indented. And then we get the main clause, the great Anunnaki forced the Igigu to do the hard work. Again, when clause or temporal clause, then parenthetical clause, then the main clause. Now, when we go to Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, we see that we get the exact same sentence structure, at least if we're understanding the Hebrew correctly. Let me pause here to note, however, that the most familiar English language translation of Genesis 1, 1 through 3, I think is incorrect. What you find, let's say, in the King James translation, carried out in the early 1600s, published in the year 1611 under the authority of King James in England. The King James translation translates the first verse of the Bible as its own sentence. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. However, that is not really the best translation of that verse, as already Rashi, the greatest of the Jewish Bible commentators, recognized back in the 1200s. The first verse of the Bible is not itself a whole sentence. The first sentence of the Bible spreads over 3 verses, and it reads as follows. So what I'm about to read to you is my own translation, but this is a translation that follows Rashi's understanding of the syntax, and almost all of the modern Bible translations, whether done by Christians or by Jews, follow Rashi's translation, which we realize understands the Hebrew syntax in the most precise and correct way. In Genesis 1 through 3, we read, "At the beginning, when God created sky and earth, the earth had been a muddle and a jumble, only darkness on the surface of the deep. God's wind was hovering on the water. God said, there should be light, and there was light." What we see here is a 3-part sentence. Verse 1 is the when clause, or the temporal clause, when God began to create sky and earth. Then we get the parenthetical clause in verse 2, which begins with the words v'ha'aretz hayeta. In biblical Hebrew, the, followed by a noun, followed by a verb, which is what we've got here, v'ha'aretz hayeta. That is the way of introducing a parenthesis in biblical Hebrew syntax. So we get this parenthetical clause describing what the earth was like before God began to create order. And then we get the main clause. God said there should be light, and there was light. Vayomer Elohim yehi or, vayihi or. So what we're finding here is simply that Genesis chapter 1 follows the conventions of ancient Near Eastern creation stories. Just like some of you might remember from reading Homer and reading Virgil and reading Hesiod, or even reading Milton, that in the Western literary tradition, there's a correct way to begin an epic poem. The way that you begin an epic poem is that you ask the goddesses of poetry, you ask the muses to help you sing, to help you compose this poem. That's the way that Homer begins the Iliad. That's the way that Homer begins the Odyssey. That's the way that Hesiod begins the Theogony, all of those in Greek. That's the way that Virgil begins the Aeneid in Latin. As late as the 1600s, that's the way that John Milton begins his epic poem, Paradise Lost. This is a literary convention that was so strong that even Milton, who was a monotheist and didn't believe in gods and goddesses, even he begins his epic poem this way, even though he doesn't believe they exist. That's the right way to begin an epic poem. So too, in the ancient Near East, there was a right way to begin a creation myth. You begin with this syntax. And you might notice that it's a complicated sentence that eventually gets to the main clause. You might say that the plot of these stories follows the syntax, in that the plot describes a journey from chaos and complexity to order and simplicity. And that's exactly what's going on in the syntax. We have a complicated sentence with a when clause, then a long parenthetical clause, and then finally we get to the main clause, so that the syntax, like the plot, is moving from chaos or complexity to order and simplicity. I'm not going to go over it right now, but the second creation story in Genesis, which begins in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, this second story of creation also begins with this syntax. I've got a translation and the Hebrew on page 2. You'll see that here too, we've got the "at the time when" phrase, then a parenthetical phrase that I've put between dashes, and then starting at verse 7, we get the main phrase. So the Israelites clearly knew about these ancient Near Eastern creation texts. The Israelites knew what their Canaanite and Babylonian and Assyrian neighbors were saying about creation. Their literary culture was part of a wider ancient Near Eastern literary culture, just like, nowadays, European cultures have in some ways a single literary culture, even though that literature is written in English and French and German and Russian in a bunch of different languages, but there's a single culture in some ways in the literatures of those that appear in those languages. So too, ancient Hebrew literature was part and parcel of ancient Near Eastern literature more broadly. And the ancient Israelite sages and priests who composed the Bible utilized some of the conventions of ancient Near Eastern literary culture. It's not only in the syntax that we see that Genesis chapter 1 fits into its cultural context. The details of the text, of the plot, also are actually in some ways reminiscent of Enuma Elish. What is created when tends to be the same in Genesis chapter 1 and in Enuma Elish. In particular, one element especially stands out, which is that in both Genesis and in Enuma Elish, light is created before there are luminaries. Light is created before there are things that give off light, which is actually rather odd. That is, before there is the sun or the moon or the stars that give off light, there was already light before then. Now, this might not seem as odd to us as modern people who actually know something about the Big Bang and know that, yeah, there were photons and there was light, therefore, long before there were stars. But from an ancient point of view, it's really quite surprising that both Enuma Elish and Genesis 1 say that there was light before there were stars, before there were luminaries. So I think it's clear that the authors of Genesis 1 knew about Enuma Elish and in some ways were playing off of Enuma Elish as they introduced this in some ways very different new monotheistic story of creation. They were using elements from an older polytheistic pagan story of creation, which they were in some ways kind of inverting and overturning. Just two other elements that I'll mention. Enuma Elish begins by mentioning the goddess of salt water who becomes the queen of chaos. She's the queen of chaos. She's the goddess who will be defeated by Marduk, by her great-great-great-great-grandson Marduk, and killed by Marduk. Her name is Tiamat. You see that name Tiamat on page 1, about 4 lines or 4 lines down, Tiamat, the primeval one, the progenitor. Genesis chapter 1 mentions Tehom. Tehom is what I translated as the deep. Tehom was the watery deep that was made of salt water. Well, the Hebrew word Tehom is simply a Hebrew equivalent of the Akkadian word Tiamat. I could go into the comparative Semitic linguistics of this. I'm not going to spend the time on that right now, but trust me on this, Tehom and Tiamat are essentially the same word, or they are what linguists call cognates. It's not a surprise that Genesis mentions Tehom in its opening lines, just as Enuma Elish mentions Tiamat in its opening lines, but Genesis chapter 1 uses the word in a different way. Tehom is still the watery deep, the salt waters, the oceans, but Tehom is no longer a goddess. She's no longer a personal force of chaos. She's simply chaotic, murky waters that don't yet have a place, that don't yet have their own structure, because God hasn't imposed structure on that chaos. But she's no longer opposed to God, and God no longer has to fight her. In fact, I should really say fight it, because Tehom is no longer a character. God doesn't have to fight Tehom. God just decides to create order out of Tehom. And once God decides to do that, that order is created. The same thing happens later with the word Tanin. Tanin, which refers to whales or leviathans or sea monsters. In the Canaanite version of the creation story, the Tanin play a major role as characters who fight against the god Baal. Baal defeats them and probably then goes on to create the world and become king of the gods. Tanin are also mentioned later in Genesis chapter 1, but again, they're no longer sea monsters who fight God. Instead, God creates them and places them into the oceans just because God has decided to do that. So some of the same vocabulary shows up, but it's being used differently so that the ancient audience will notice how this polytheistic story is being transformed into a monotheistic story. There are no longer forces of chaos that God has to fight. Instead, there are simply things that God creates. There is chaos that God structures, but the fighting is all God. I've been making the argument up until now simply that Genesis 1 is a typical story of creation from the ancient Near East, even though it goes off in its own directions as the only monotheistic story of creation. But Genesis 1 is typical of these ancient Near Eastern creation stories, and therefore the ancient audience who knew the literary culture of this time and place, their expectations of Genesis chapter 1 were shaped by all these other myths. And that makes one of the two great differences between Genesis 1 and these other myths all the more notable. The one difference is that it's a monotheistic creation story, but the other is that the end that we're expecting never arrives. What do I mean by that? When I say the end that we're expecting on the basis of these other myths never arrives in Genesis chapter 1. Well, in the other texts, in Egyptian mythology, in Canaanite mythology, in Babylonian and Assyrian mythology, the end of the creation myth, the climax of the creation myth, is the building of the high god's palace or temple. Either the god himself or the other gods build a palace for the main god, and that palace turns out to be the main temple of whatever group of people we're talking about. So in Enuma Elish, towards the end of Enuma Elish, the Anunnaki gods, those are the higher ranking gods, they build Marduk's temple, which is known as the Esagila temple, a palace for Marduk to dwell in. And the Esagila temple is actually the temple that was located in the city of this, in the center of the city of Babylon. It was the central temple of the Babylonian Empire. And it takes a year for the higher ranking gods just to make the bricks to go ahead and build the temple. Once they've made the bricks, which takes a year, they go on and they build Marduk's temple. We're expecting from all these ancient myths that, okay, so the end of this text should be that either God himself builds a temple, probably the temple in Jerusalem or some sort of temple, or other heavenly beings, the angels, should build a temple. But we get to the end of Genesis 1, and instead, at the climax, instead of reading about a temple being built in Jerusalem or in some specific space, instead we read about Shabbat, which leads Professor Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Zichrono Livracha, to say that in the Bible, Shabbat is a palace in time. And instead of getting to the building of a temple, we get a holy space, we get to the commemoration or the principle that there is a holy time instead of a holy place. But there's some sense that the final shoe never dropped. We never get to where we're expecting to get. We don't read about how God built the temple in Jerusalem, or the angels built the temple in Jerusalem up in heaven and then transported it down to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. From an ancient Near Eastern point of view, we never get to where we're supposed to be going. And in that respect, creation never quite finishes. Now, I want to say a bit more about this. I want to go now to the book of Exodus, which picks up on this theme. But I think this is a good time for us to pause for a while and take some questions just on what I've said so far. I've so far, in addition to talking a little bit about the theme of liminality, so far I've tried to make the case that Genesis chapter 1 is a text that is a typical ancient Near Eastern text in some respects, and therefore to understand it correctly, to understand it fully, we need to read it in dialogue with a number of other ancient texts, especially Enuma Elish from ancient Babylonia, and that when we do so, we realize that it doesn't get to where we expect it's going. We get to the end of this creation text, and there's this interesting thing about the Sabbath, but there's no temple, there's no palace for God to live in. There's no palace, no temple in which human beings can come to meet God and worship God. And in that respect, creation seems to be unfinished. We haven't fully gotten to where we're going to. And it's in that respect that it portrays the world as liminal. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that liminality theme, but why don't we pause now, and Julia, maybe you can share some of the questions that have been coming in.
Absolutely, thank you. So a few people asked in different ways. They kind of are noting that there's already water here that God is dividing between, or there's already, an assumption of an earth being there. So they're asking, is this really a creation or sort of an organization, which I think connects really to what you're saying. And so, but I don't know if you would expand what you're saying that far to say that.
Yes. Yeah, that was really well phrased. In some sense, we could say that this is a story, well, we might say not so much about creation as it is about organization. Or maybe we could say that the way Genesis 1 conceptualizes creation is that creation is about organization. It's about creating structure where there had been chaos. But Genesis 1, perhaps surprisingly from our point of view, doesn't actually describe what's called in Latin creation ex nihilo, creation of something out of nothing, or in Hebrew we would say yesh me'ayin, something out of nothing. At the beginning of the story, there already is water, and there already is some sort of mass of stuff intermixed with the water. There already is heaven and earth, but they're all mixed up. There's water, there's oceans, there's continents, there's heaven, but they're all mixed up. They don't have their own places. There's light, somehow simultaneously there's light and dark, and they're not yet separated from each other. And what God does here is, it's not that God makes something where there was nothing. It's that God puts all these different somethings in their own place so that the world becomes recognizable to us, livable to us, usable to us. Now, from a monotheistic point of view, this is surprising and problematic. If God is omnipotent, then why was there stuff there already to begin with? If God is omnipotent, then God has to be there before the stuff is there, and God has to create the stuff. And in later Jewish, Christian, and Muslim theology, this becomes a really important point. It becomes important that God actually created the stuff, first of all, and then God organized it. And that makes sense, I think, from a monotheistic point of view. At some level, that's what I believe. But interestingly, Genesis doesn't tell the story that way. I mean, what Genesis says doesn't contradict that idea. It might be the case that this stuff was already there because previously God had created it, but Genesis doesn't tell that story. Genesis starts the story with a situation in which there's a lot of stuff and it's all mixed up. Where the stuff comes from, Genesis doesn't talk about. So far as we know, probably one of the first thinkers to come up with the idea that, no, God has to have actually created the stuff was the author of the last part of the book of Isaiah, the author that's often referred to by modern Bible scholars as Second Isaiah or Deutero-Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 45 especially, and a few other stray phrases elsewhere in the 40s, in the chapters 40 and following of Isaiah, that author seems to have read Genesis 1 and seems to have realized that it's disturbing that Genesis 1 just says there was stuff there from the beginning and doesn't explain that God created the stuff. And so that prophet, the prophet Deutero-Isaiah, introduces the idea of creation ex nihilo, but that idea doesn't really catch on in Jewish philosophy up until hundreds of years later. It becomes more important in the work of the Jewish philosopher Philo, who lived in the first century, the late first century BCE, early first century CE. Through Philo, this idea becomes very important in Christian philosophy and Christian theology. Only later, actually, does this really become an important idea in Jewish philosophy, especially in the work of Maimonides. And now it's standard in all Jewish philosophy. But really, that idea is not quite there yet in Genesis chapter 1. It's mentioned in passing by a little later by Deutero-Isaiah, but it doesn't become standard until much, much later. By the way, the reason King James translates the way that it translates the opening passage rather than the way that I translated it following Rashi, the way that my translation follows Rashi, is that King James, those translators believed in the idea of creation ex nihilo. And so if you misinterpret the syntax of that complex first sentence and you make it into 3 separate sentences, then it sounds like, well, first, God created heaven and the earth. Then things were kind of a mess. So then God created light, et cetera, et cetera. But it's probably the reason that King James and many other Western translations, both Jewish and Christians, of the Bible mistranslate those first verses is that they add the idea of creation ex nihilo into a text that didn't originally really have it.
Great, thank you. Right, I got a new flood of questions. Not that we're
Flood's a little later. That's
not
chapter 7, yet. Chapter 8.
But I'll try to share 1 or 2 more here. So kind of following on what you were just talking about, a few people were also noting that that God is here from the beginning, and asking why Genesis kind of dwells on the creation of the natural world versus a pantheon, or sort of focusing on the gods. And anyone who's learned with you before has heard you talk about our God being one of many in the ancient world, but that's just here from the beginning. This one God who's at the center of things, as opposed to kind of talking about that aspect of that sort of foundation of the story. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So Genesis chapter 1 actually does presume that there are other heavenly beings. It refers to them just in passing in verses 26 and 27, really in 26, when God says, Na'aseh Adam b'tzelmenu, let's make a human being in our own image. This is a reference to the idea that shows up in Enuma Elish, that it took several different gods to create humanity. It's both the case in Enuma Elish and also in Atrahasis, which is that other Babylonian creation text that I mentioned on page 1 of the handout. In both of those, several deities have to cooperate to create humanity. Genesis chapter 1 alludes to that idea in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, when God says, let's make humanity in our image. God seems to be talking there to other heavenly beings, but then God goes on to do it all by God's self in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. God seems to be sort of being polite to the other deities, but God does all the work by God's self. And the reason I think that verse is there is so that we'll recognize this is another case of sort of raising an expectation that gets dashed. We're expecting God to participate, maybe with a mother goddess, or at least with some other deities, to create humanity, but actually that's not what happens. God does it all by God's self. And by alluding to Enuma Elish and Atrahasis and the way that the creation of humanity was a joint effort, by alluding to that idea, Genesis chapter 1 is making really clear that that idea is not here. So I think Genesis 1 presumes that there are other deities up there. They're completely subservient to the creator God. It's not so much that he is the God, that Hashem is one among many. It is rather the case that there is God with a capital G, and then there are all these other deities who are lower ranking and don't have any real power of their own. But Genesis 1 does allude to the existence of those deities. They're fairly insignificant, so they only get mentioned in passing once. But their creation is not something they're unimportant enough that we're not interested in where they came from. That's very different from a polytheistic text. Enuma Elish begins with a whole description of the first generation, Tiamat and Apsu, their children, Lachmu and Lachamu, and then generation after generation after generation of the deities. And what ends up being interesting in Enuma Elish is that the god who ends up being in charge, Marduk, is much younger than the world. First, you had this chaos. It existed for multiple generations. Finally, Marduk comes into existence. He ends up leading one side of a civil war between two different sets of gods, he kills off the original gods. And then the gods who are in charge of the world as we know it proceed to create order, to create the world as we know it now. But the world was actually older than the gods who are in charge now. That's very different from Genesis chapter 1. One of the monotheistic points that Genesis chapter 1 makes is God is as old as the world. That's unprecedented in the ancient Near East. Everywhere else in the ancient Near East, the gods and goddesses are younger than the world, and they are in many ways subject to the world. In Genesis chapter 1, however, God is as old as the world and is not subject to the world. What happens later is that Philo, various Christian theologians, Muslim theologians, eventually also Maimonides, come to realize that no, for monotheism to really be monotheism, it's not just good enough that God is as old as the world, God has to be older than the world. But Genesis 1 is trying to make a monotheistic point. It hasn't gotten as monotheistic as later Jewish, Christian, well, actually to go in order, as later, really in a way, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish theology will become. So yeah, it is important to realize that that God here is just there at the beginning, matter's there at the beginning too, and God is as old as the world.
Thank you. So maybe just one more quick one before you go on. It's not so central to your point, but several people asked, so I wanted to pass on the question about that you translated Yehi Or as there should be light, as opposed to the more familiar let there be light. I don't know if you want to shed any light on that situation.
Yofi, great. Yeah, in part, I think one of the problems with a really great translation is that it becomes so familiar that we begin to not notice it. And I think I just wanted to do something a little bit different than the phrasing, which is there already in King James, continues to be in use. It's there in the JPS translation. Let there be light, and there was light. The truth is, there should be light and let there be light are kind of the same, are two ways of saying the same thing. Grammatically speaking, these are both not indicative verbs, but they are volitive verbs. These are both ways of saying not a fact, but expressing a desire. The Hebrew phrase Yehi Or is what's known grammatically as a jussive or a volitive. It's an expression of desire, not an expression of fact. Now, of course, in God's case, what God desires becomes fact immediately. For the rest of us, verbs don't work that way. But that verb is not an indicative verb. It's a volitive verb. And in English, the volitive, we can express the volitive through the word let, like let something be this way, or we can express it through the word should. There are a number of other ways of expressing it in English, but probably in American English, should is the easiest way, the most familiar way. And I do prefer there should be light over let there be light, because when God says in English, let there be light, the truth is let is an imperative verb which is spoken to somebody. And it's as if though God is saying to some other being somewhere or another, would you please allow there to be light? But God isn't speaking to anybody. The verb yehi in Hebrew is not an imperative verb. It's not a second person verb. It's not addressing anybody. It's a third person verb that just states God's desire. And so I do kind of prefer there should be light over let there be light, just because let there be light implies that God is speaking to somebody. God is addressing somebody as if that other person is going to give permission for there to be light. And that's not what's going on here. God is just stating, it is my desire that there should be light. And once God states that, there is light. So that, yeah, those are the reasons that I went with that translation. Although, I mean, basically, let there be light and there should be light. They're almost the exact same. I do think there should be light it's a little fresher, and I think it's a little bit more accurate.
Great. So I see us eating away at the time. So I'll keep going through the questions that have come in, and you can go back to your sources.
Okay. So I've made the point that Genesis 1 sort of concludes without ending. It concludes without the ending that the ancient reader is expecting. There's no creation of a palace for God to dwell in a temple for humans to worship God in, which in these texts, those things are basically tend to be the same. A temple is both a place where God dwells and it's a place where humans go to worship the God. Now, it ends that way without the expected ending. But of course, those of you, spoiler alert, who have read ahead in the Torah know, later in the Torah, such a structure is in fact erected. Namely, in the book of Exodus, the Israelites build what is alternately known as the Mishkan, that is to say, the dwelling or the tabernacle, or the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. The tent that the Israelites build under Moses' supervision in the book of Exodus, in the last half of the book of Exodus, it is both the Mishkan, it is where God dwells. God, in some sense, is physically present in the Holy of Holies at the back of the Mishkan. And it is also an Ohel Moed, a tent of meeting. It is where the nation Israel meets God and worships God at the altar by offering sacrifices at the altar. And so later in the Torah, we do actually get the creation of a temple for God, but it's surprising in several ways. Number one, it's surprising because human beings build it rather than God himself or other heavenly beings. In the other ancient texts, this happens usually either before or after humanity is created, but human beings are not involved in the creation of the temple. It's the king of the gods himself who builds it, or the lower gods build it for the king of the gods, build it for the king of the gods. But in Exodus, it turns out to be human beings, and more specifically, not very socially prestigious human beings who build the palace for God. It's actually a group of escaped slaves, the lowest of the low, and they're not even from a major country. They're not Egyptian or Babylonian or Assyrian. They're not from the great empires, the great centers of culture in the ancient Near East. Instead, it's a bunch of Hebrew slaves who build the temple for God. So that's very, very surprising. And the other surprise is that this happens kind of in the wrong time and place. It doesn't happen as the climax to creation back in the creation story. It happens thousands of years later, and it happens off in the wilderness. It doesn't happen in the city of Babylon, one of the great centers of power and culture of the ancient Near East. It doesn't happen in the city of Assyria or Nineveh, which is what happens in Babylonian and Assyrian stories. Instead, it doesn't even happen in Jerusalem, which is the capital city of this insignificant little country called Judah. It doesn't even happen in that capital city. It happens off in the wilderness, a place that is neither here nor there. It's in a place where humans don't live on a permanent basis. It's not part of any nation, of any nation state or kingdom or empire. So it's a surprise that it's showing up in the wrong part of the text at the wrong time in the plot and in the wrong place. And yet it's very clear that the story of the creation of the tabernacle, the erecting or the building of the tabernacle, it is in a way the climax of creation, because this story in the end of the book of Exodus links back intimately to the story in Genesis chapter 1. To understand why I say this, we'll go to page 3 of the handout. So if we could again share the screen, and those of you who have the handout on your own, if you could turn to page 3 of that handout. When we go to page 3 of the handout, I've given you in one set of boxes some individual verses from the creation story in Genesis 1. And in the first set of verses that I've given to you, you'll see that I put some words in bold. If you printed it out, I think it's pretty clear on your screen. You might want to make it bigger because for some reason the bolding works as the font gets bigger on your screen. You'll see that I put in bold the words Vayar over and over and over again. We keep on finding out that God sees something and then he pronounces it good. That happens in verse 4, verse 10, verse 12, verses 17 and 18. It's not just that God creates things and then he looks at it and judges it. And he judges it good. That that word vayar, he saw, God saw, it repeats over and over again. We also get the words vayavarech, God blesses what God had made. That's in verse 22. God blesses the creatures that God made. Going on to the next page of the handout, to the top of page 4, again, we keep on seeing the word vayar on the top of page 4. In addition, we get some other words that I put in bold. God saw everything that he had made, and behold, or look, vihine, the Hebrew there is vihine, which I've translated as look. God saw and behold, or look, it was good. Then going on to the part that deals with Shabbat at the beginning of chapter 2, we see vocabulary that's familiar to a lot of us from Friday Night Kiddush. We see the words vayachulu that I've put in bold. God complete. Heaven and earth were completed. You see again the word vayachal. God completed the work. Milachto, or the word milacha. The word I've put in bold, asher asa, that he made, that's in bold. Again, we get the word milacha and asa in bold on the next line, mikol milachto asher asa, all the work that he had performed or that he had done. Again, then we get the word vayavarech, he blessed. Vayikadesh, I put in bold, he made it holy. And again, we get the words milacha and asa in bold, the work that God had done. The reason I put all these words, he saw, he blessed, he made holy, he completed, or it was completed, the work that was done, the reason those particular vocabulary items from Genesis 1 are in bold is that when we go to the section that describes the completion of the tabernacle, the completion of the Mishkan in the book of Exodus, those words show up again. And I think that this is, so many of them show up, and they show up repeatedly, that it's clear that Exodus chapters 39 and 40, which describe the completion of building the tabernacle by the Israelites, are linked back to Genesis chapter 1. I won't go through all of the verses right now, but on page 4, just real quickly, you'll see that the dwelling was completed in in Exodus 39, 32. The dwelling was complete. Vaytechel, vayaasu. The children of Israel did the work. We get that word "did" twice. You go a few verses forward in Exodus chapter 39, 43, Moses sees all the work, and behold, they had done it correctly, and Moses blessed them for doing the work. So milacha, hine, asa, vayavarech, all this work is showing up. All these words are showing up again. The verb likadesh shows up in chapter 40, verse 9. It shows up actually 3 times in chapter 40, verse 9. If we go to page 5 of the handout, it shows up yet again on the top of page 5 of the handout. And then we get again the word vayechal, the word about completion, and the word milacha. Those words are showing up in Exodus 39 and 40 to signal to us these are sort of bookends. There's a story that began in Genesis 1 that ends in Exodus 39 and 40. It comes to where it's supposed to arrive only in Exodus 39 and 40 with the Israelites building the Mishkan for God. So in a way, Exodus chapters 39 and 40, they are part, I would say they are really part of the creation story. The creation story only comes to its climax here at the end of the book of Exodus. But there are 2 really crucial differences between what we were expecting from the ancient Near Eastern stories and what we end up getting in the creation story in the Torah that spans the books of Genesis and Exodus, that goes from the very first chapter of Genesis to the very last 2 chapters of Exodus. Okay, we finally have gotten to where we're supposed to get. We have finally gotten to the part where the palace, the temple for the God is completed. But number 1, As I said before, what's odd is that human beings complete the work here rather than God or the gods. The final capstone to creation is placed not by not by heavenly beings, but by human beings, by humble escaped slaves. They're the ones who create the capstone for creation. That's extraordinarily surprising, number one. That's not the way the story is supposed to work from the ancient Near Eastern point of view. The other thing is that the palace that is finally built for God, for the creator of the universe, it's not a permanent structure. It's portable. In Enuma Elish, the gods spent one whole year just making the bricks for the construction project. It's a very permanent, large structure. But in Exodus, the Mishkan, it's actually a portable tent. It's a portable structure that the Israelites, they put it up and take it down again and again and again. And so in that respect, in a way, not only is it the case that humans complete the work of creation rather than the gods, but humans are completing the work of creation over and over again. They pack it up and they tear it down, they take it on the road, and then they build it back up again, because this palace, the Mishkan, in this case, this particular palace is not a permanent structure. It's something that comes and goes, that gets packed up and torn down and then created again. Furthermore, when we go into the next page, when we go into the book of Vayikra, Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, it becomes clear that another responsibility of this group of humans, of the Israelites, is to continue keeping the Mishkan, the divine palace, in a ritually appropriate state. One of the purposes of the korbanot, the so-called sacrifices, although sacrifices is really not quite the right translation for what Leviticus is describing, but the korbanot, what are often referred to as the sacrifices, one of their main functions is to allow God to continue dwelling in the Mishkan. The very last thing that happens in the book of Exodus, after Moses has completed all the work for the Mishkan, in the last 5 verses of the book of Exodus, God's presence, the Kvod Adonai, the presence of God, or I even translate that term as the body of God, which had been in heaven and then had come down to the top of Mount Sinai and then waited on Mount Sinai for 10 months for the Mishkan to be erected, that body, that presence, that divine presence leaves Mount Sinai and comes into the Mishkan. And once it comes into the Mishkan, something paradoxical has happened, which is that the God who stands outside the universe, because God creates the universe, the God who is transcendent comes into the universe, comes into what this God has created. The transcendent God becomes immanent. And that's a hard thing to accomplish. That's a pretty tricky thing to do correctly without accidentally destroying the universe itself, since God's power is more powerful than the entirety of all the powers in the universe itself. That's why the Mishkan had to be built according to such very, very exacting rules that we get in great, great detail in Exodus chapters 25 through 31, and whose exact execution, the exact execution of those roles, had to be described in great detail in Exodus chapter 35 through 40. The reason those rules matter so much is that this is paradoxical. The idea that the transcendent God can become immanent, that shouldn't be. But as it were, there's a kind of magic that God gives the Israelites that allows this to happen. And they have to keep on performing the korbanot that are described in Leviticus chapters 1 through 7 for this situation to endure. And so it's not just that they created God's palace, the palace is done, it stays there forever, the story's over. This is an ongoing story. For one thing, they keep on taking the palace down and re-erecting it in new places. But for another, the Israelites have to keep on following a series of ritual laws, and also ultimately in Leviticus chapters 18 and following, ethical laws that allow for the purely ethical God to live, to dwell in the world itself. And so God never finishes the work of creation in Genesis chapter 1. It's humans who are tasked with the work of completing creation. But even then, that work is never completely finished. It's never quite fully finished. Instead, the world is always on this journey from chaos to order, but it never quite arrives permanently at order. And it's up to human beings to bring about the continuation of this journey to greater and greater order, greater and greater perfection. In fact, according to this creation story, this is the creation story. All the texts that we've been dealing with from the Torah are from the priestly part of the Torah. This is from the ancient Kohanim's view of things. According to the ancient priests, according to the Kohanim, who wrote these sections of the Pentateuch, of the Torah, the entire reason that God chose the nation Israel to be the chosen people is that they are tasked with the job of perfecting creation. They are tasked with the job of allowing order to continue gaining over chaos. And when they do their job right, we get closer to perfection and further from chaos. And when, as often happens, they don't fulfill their responsibilities, then chaos can come back, and chaos can become more powerful and begin to reign, even to reign supreme. The world itself is liminal, according to this story, because God deliberately chose not to finish creating the world. God chose that there should be human beings who would have the responsibility to finish the world. And that group of human beings are always supposed to be involved in that activity of perfecting the world, even though they know they'll never fully get there. Now, this is an idea that is found in what we modern Bible scholars call the priestly document, the P document, the part of the Torah written by the Kohanim, but it's not an idea that is unique to the Kohanim. The idea that we have the responsibility to do a certain kind of work, even though we know we're never going to complete that work, we're never going to do it perfectly, that's an idea that shows up again in Pirkei Avot. So this is at the bottom of page 5 of the handout, in a very famous saying in Pirkei Avot, in which Rabbi Tarfon says, lots of you could say this, lots of you could say this by memory or could sing this, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, v'lo ata ven chorin lihibatel mimena. You are not responsible to complete the work, but you are not free to relinquish it. You are not free to desist from that work. And the word used for work there, milacha, I put in bold because that's one of the words that back in Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Exodus 39 and 40, I put in bold. That's this, not coincidentally, the same word that was being described back there. This is the work, we're talking here of the work of creating the world. We have the responsibility to continue that milacha of creating and ordering the world, of creating structure where there was chaos. Even though we know we'll never complete that work, we aren't allowed to desist from that work. This idea of the Jewish people as completing that work of creation, it's also a central idea. Actually, some people would even say the central idea of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism. Already in the Zohar, in fact, already even in some Midrashic texts much earlier, but already in the Zohar, the most famous and central work of Jewish mysticism from about the 13th century CE, we get the idea that when Jews perform rituals, Jews are actually helping God, and thus are helping overcome chaos. That idea then gets a new name a few centuries later in the Kabbalistic teachings of Isaac Luria, of the Ari. In the Ari's Kabbalah, the Lurianic Kabbalah, this is called Tikkun. Tikkun even, or Tikkun Olam. Human beings or Jews are supposed to perform certain ritual tasks, and by performing those ritual tasks, they bring greater perfection to the world. And when they don't perform those responsibilities, they bring greater chaos to the world. But ultimately, the Ari teaches Jews will eventually someday perform these tasks well enough that the world will finally be complete, and we will fully have left the realm of chaos and gotten to a peaceful, universal, literally universal order. Modern Jews, I think, take that idea one step forward by saying it's not only through ritual action, but also through ethical action that we defeat chaos and create this order. That idea of tikkun olam, many of us associate that either with Kabbalah or with a certain kind of modern liberal Judaism. But really, that idea of tikkun olam goes back to Genesis chapter 1. The idea that the world, that God deliberately left the world incomplete, left the world in a liminal state, and it is the responsibility of the Jewish people to complete that work of creation. That world is that idea is not only a modern Jewish idea of liberal modern Judaism. It's not only an idea of medieval Kabbalah. It's actually an idea that starts with the Bible and starts quite literally with the first chapter of the Bible. As I often, some of you have studied with me before, and not surprisingly, we've ended up in the exact same place that I always end up. I'm trying to make the point that a certain kind of modern liberal Jewish idea is in fact not only modern and not only liberal, it goes back to the Bible itself. And that's something that we, capital C, conservative Jews, should keep in mind about our own Judaism and its authenticity and antiquity. Tov, we could probably end the screen share, and we have time, and I could stay for a few extra minutes. I'm very happy to stay for a few extra minutes for some more questions, Julia.
All right, thank you so much. I think this session just hit the record of volume of questions. They're coming in like one every few seconds. So I just want to tell everyone, thank you so much for these really amazing questions you're sending. And I'm sorry, we're not going to get to so many of them. So while I'm tempted to end on the lofty note that you just ended on, I'm tempted to stay there, but there were, I do want to kind of voice some of the questions that a lot of people were asking. So there were several questions about the idea of the Mishkan, you know, as the, I was going to say the completion, but sort of the non-completion in parallel to the other creation myths. So kind of drilling into that, I'm just going to read you a handful of questions related to that. So where does God go when the Mishkan is taken down? The temple in Jerusalem, is that the end of the narrative for real? And then does the partnership end? What about the temple being destroyed? Maybe I'll leave it there. Sort of.
Let me address those ones from a biblical point of view and a little bit from a rabbinic point of view, real quickly to begin with. So in the desert, God actually, or the Kvod Adonai, which is surrounded by a cloud, decides when it's time for them to break camp and move to a new campsite. And the Israelites, they don't make that decision on their own. God lets the Israelites know this by actually leaving the Mishkan. When this happens, they can see that the cloud is on top of the Mishkan. They can't see God directly. If they saw God directly, they would all die. So there's this thick cloud around God's presence, around the Kavod Adonai that protects the people. When they see that cloud on top of the Mishkan, they know, oh, it's time for us to break camp. The Levites go, they take the Mishkan down. The Israelites take their own little tents that they dwell in down, and they start marching to the next place as the Kavod Adonai leads them to their next campsite. This is described very, very briefly just in the last 4 verses of the book of Exodus, actually. And then this happens again and again throughout the book of Numbers. Eventually, the Mishkan comes into the land of Israel. Long term, Solomon one day builds a temple that replaces the Mishkan. The temple actually has the exact same structure as the Mishkan. It's twice as big, but its proportions, the rooms that it has and the size of the rooms, its proportions are identical to those of the Mishkan. And so then God dwells there according to the priestly ideology, but not forever. God will only dwell there as long as the Israelites keep the ritual and ethical situation in such a state that God can remain there. But when either ritual impurity or ethical immorality rises to a certain level, God won't stay. That's part of the reasons for the laws in the book of Leviticus, to allow God to stay. And we're told that that about 500 years after Solomon built the temple, God had had enough. The levels of impurity and sinfulness had gone high enough that God leaves. And the book of Ezekiel, which is a prophetic book, but a prophetic book written by a Kohen, written by a priest. So he's very, very closely linked with the authors of Genesis chapter 1 and the end of the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus. The priest prophet Ezekiel describes how he saw the Kavod Adonai in the temple stand up, walk over to the door. A kruv, a heavenly winged being, flew down from heaven. God got onto that kruv, and Ezekiel describes how that kruv then goes up and east. It goes up because God's going back to heaven, and it goes east because God's going to be in heaven above Babylonia, because even though God's angry at the people, God wants to stay near the people, and God is going to send the people in exile to Babylonia. So God ends up going back to heaven, and presumably God has stayed there ever since. But there is, there is an expectation that ultimately a third temple will be built, and God will come back again to dwell in that third temple when God notifies us it's time to do so. So this, in rabbinic literature as well, this idea continues to have force. But in the meantime, it's our job as Jews to create the situation that will invite God back into the cosmos. So this partnership, in a way, does still continue. It's still our job, I think, in rabbinic literature to continue creating the situation, in this case, that would allow God to come back into the world, as opposed to the situation of keeping God within the world.
Great, thank you. So I want to formally, I'd love to ask you some more questions. Maybe if you could stay on for a few minutes, that'd be great, but I want to kind of formally end the session for those who need to go. So I want to once again thank Yael Aspel for being our inaugural sponsor for this series, and hope that his example will inspire others. And of course, thank you, Professor Sommer, for teaching and for kicking off the series with such a kind of captivating session based on the flood of questions that have come in. I thank everyone for being here and for your questions. Next week, we will have Dr. Rachel Rosenthal teaching us on Between This World and the Next, looking at rabbinic texts to understand Gehinom, or purgatory, if you want to translate it that way, kind of in between worlds, now that we've created the world. And then in a couple of weeks, Professor Sommer will actually be back with us teaching about the tent of meeting, which he mentioned a number of times today. So that's what's coming up. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Professor Sommer, for teaching. And since you're willing to stay, I will ask you some more.
Great.
So great, thanks. Many people asked about the Tower of Babel. And isn't that, kind of much before the Mishkan, isn't that the next big thing that gets built or that they're attempting to build? And is that maybe supposed to be the completion of creation, or did they think it was supposed to be? How does that fit into what you're?
Yeah, great question. The Tower of Babel it was the first big thing that got built. So a few thoughts on the Tower of Babel. First of all, as I mentioned, my talk today was really about a sort of a long trajectory in the plot, not really of the Pentateuch, but of what I'm calling the priestly document. I said a few times in passing that all the texts that I was dealing with today come from the part of the Torah written by the priests. Some of you know about what's called the documentary hypothesis. There's a hypothesis in modern biblical studies that the Torah was put together in ancient times from 3 or 4 main blocks of material that were originally independent, but that got spliced together. One of those blocks of material, the one that gives the Torah its overall structure and shape, was written by Kohanim from Jerusalem, in other words, priests. So we modern Bible scholars refer to it as the priestly document, or just by an abbreviation as the P document. The Tower of Babel story is not from P. P doesn't know from a Tower of Babel story. The Tower of Babel story is from what scholars call the J document. So so my first answer to the question is that the Tower of Babel doesn't really fit into the story, because it's actually not part of the story. The priests never talk about the Tower of Babel, but it does relate to the story, because I think it's clear that the Tower of Babel story probably actually is alluding to the Esagila temple that I mentioned before, that there was this tower in the Esagila temple in the city of Babylon. But from the Israelite point of view, it wasn't the right temple, because it's a temple to the wrong God. And insofar as it's a temple to the wrong God, and it's also a temple of an imperial conquering power, because it's in the capital city of Babylon, which was, you know, the one of the oppressive imperial powers of the ancient Near East from the Israelite point of view, because it's a temple to the wrong God and it's associated with this imperial human power. It's really an idolatrous structure, because it's not built for the glory of the true God who created the world. It's built for the glory of some other minor God who's only in charge of this one little city, and shouldn't be in charge of a whole empire. And it's idolatrous because it's associated with empire. An empire represents the attempt of like one man, one king, to spread his rule, his power over everything. And empire, in a sense, therefore, is any imperial ambition is idolatrous, because we're building ourselves up, giving ourselves a position that God should hold. So I think that the idea that the Tower of Babel gets knocked down does fit into the idea that we're seeing in this trajectory that I was talking about, that goes from Genesis to Exodus. But that trajectory is a different trajectory. The story of the Tower of Babel is originally part of a different document that wasn't part of this narrative trajectory.
Great, thank you. Okay, so this is slightly narrower, but I think an interesting question. Someone asked early on about the word vaychulu, that the beginning of the Shabbat portion of creation is introduced with, well, I guess the end of the question of the section before, that God finished, and then there was Shabbat. So how is that word being used, and maybe differently from how we normally understand it, based on your premise that that it hasn't been finished?
Oh yeah, nice question. So at that point, it was as finished as God was going to make it. God is the subject of the verb vayachal. God has done what God is doing. But there's another piece that we're expecting. And many, many chapters later, at the end of the book of Exodus, we're going to find out that God gave that responsibility to the human beings. But in a sense, I'm saying that when we read this long narrative trajectory in light of an ancient Near Eastern pattern, and also when we remember that the tent gets set up and taken down, set up and taken down, brought to a new place, brought to a new place, I think that we realize that vayachulu doesn't mean 100% vayachulud. That completed is never 100% completed. That we shouldn't take the word. It turns out that the word lechalot here shouldn't be taken 100% literally. God completed as far as God was going to get it, and then human beings would keep on completing it, but human beings would always be in a process of completing it. And, you know, as of, according to my computer here, 2:36 p.m. on 1/30/2023, we still haven't gotten all the way there. We still haven't completed it. According to one point of view, yes, we will eventually get there in the Messianic era, but we still haven't gotten there. The word vayachal would make us think of sort of an activity that comes to an end, but in fact, it's a process. It's actually a process that, as of now, still hasn't come to an end. Yeah, good question.
Great. So let's just do one more, or I'll group a few together. But there were a lot of.
And actually, I would mention, so my next topic that I'll be talking about, it is going to be the Mishkan. That's going to be an independent sort of lecture of its own. If you didn't come to this one, you could still go to that one, but that will be very much picking up on themes from what we're talking about today. And I'll be bringing the idea of the Mishkan into dialogue, the priestly Mishkan into dialogue with other parts of the Torah written by other authors. So you can save some of these questions. If you've got a question that we didn't get to, write it down, and you might be able to re-ask it the next time, since we'll be dealing with the Mishkan next time as well.
I already wrote to a few people saying, save that question for his next session, but then there were too many. So just to finish up with, there were a few questions about the "it was good" pronouncement, and so I'm going to group those together. So this is not necessarily on your, on the larger topic, but here we are spending the whole time talking about the creation. So I thought it was still appropriate to ask. So one question was, does that pronouncement mean that God might, could also have created something that wasn't good, or ordered things in a way that wasn't good? And, or does it mean, oh, great, it worked. And then does that imply that God is not omnipotent? So there were a couple questions like that. And then the follow-up question was, we don't hear that phrase when we get to the Mishkan, as far as the questioner knows. It's not coming to my mind right away. So is there, or maybe that's just, maybe there are other explanations for that, but those were the questions about the "it was good" pronouncement that I thought I would group together to close with today.
Great. So I'll go in reverse order. So regarding the Mishkan, when we get to where we would expect ki tov, God saw that it was good. Moses keeps on seeing that it was done correctly. The Israelites built it according to specs. And it's really important that this structure was built exactly according to specifications, because this is the magical structure that allows the transcendent to become immanent without destroying the world. So it really matters that things were done according to specs. But I think that Moses saw that it was done correctly. They did it in accordance with what God had commanded. That's the equivalent of ki tov. I don't think that this is sort of an opposition to the idea of ki tov, but in the human realm, how do you know that something is good? When humans do something, if it's the equivalent of being good, is they did it according to God's commandment. So in a sense, I think that Moses saw that it was done according to God's commandment. That's the equivalent of ki tov. So the Mishkan is indeed good. It's something that God commanded. So why do we get that phrase repeated over and over again? I don't think that the priests here I don't think that they're dealing with the very, very gigantic problem of evil. Why is there evil in a world that God created as good? Does God also create evil? Is there some other being out there that creates evil? I think that there are ways of answering that question. Deutero-Isaiah, the prophet that I mentioned just a little while ago, again, around chapter 45, 46, 44, somewhere around there, Deutero-Isaiah says explicitly, Deutero-Isaiah read chapter 1 of Genesis, and I think asked the same question. So first of all, Kivanta dat Gedolim, the question that you're asking is I think a question that already a biblical author, the prophet Deutero-Isaiah, asked about Genesis 1. And Deutero-Isaiah answers that God is Yotzer Or Uvoreh Choshech, Choseh Shalom Uvoreh Tara. God creates light and darkness. God fashions that which is good and creates that which is bad, or that which is evil. That is an idea that, yeah, if God created everything, then God must have created evil as well. And we echo that line from Deutero-Isaiah every single morning in the Shacharit service, when we say God is Yotzer Or Uvoreh Choshech, Choseh Shalom Uvoreh Takol, that God creates light and darkness, that God fashions that which is good and creates everything. Now, by substituting the word kol for the prophet's ra, that is, when the Siddur uses the word God creates everything instead of God creates evil, I think that the Siddur is kind of softening this a bit, but it's still making, I think, the same point, that God creates, that God must have created everything. Genesis 1, everything that is including evil. Genesis 1 doesn't go there. I think Genesis 1 leaves the gigantic problem of theodicy to the side and doesn't ask where evil comes from. But I think that Genesis 1, in saying that God saw that everything was good, Genesis 1 is not saying that everything was perfect. For the priestly authors, what God creates is good, but it can be improved on. One of the ways that it's going to be improved on is that thousands of years later, God will give Moses the directions for how to make the Mishkan, how to build the tabernacle, and that will be an improvement. So good doesn't mean perfect. Good doesn't mean best. Good means good, but it can be improved on. And again and again, specifically in the priestly document, we see that God is open to improvements. God is open to improvements that human beings are supposed to do. God is even open to improvements that human beings suggest. I'll just give two examples of this in the P document. Maybe we'll end there. In Exodus 39 through 40, the Mishkan is completed. And then in Leviticus 8 through 10, there are a series of ceremonies to dedicate the Mishkan. There is a Chanukah, a dedication ceremony that lasts 8 days, which is how long a Chanukah should last. That's narrated in Leviticus 8 through 10. And at several points, and God gives very specific directions of how that ceremony should be carried out. In two cases, the directions that God gives for how to carry out a certain sacrifice at the ceremony diverge from God's normal directions for how to carry out that particular sacrifice. So in other words, God had given Moses some basic directions of sacrifice, but then God sort of modifies them or improvises on them just for this one time, for this one particular ceremony. And God tells Moses and Aaron, we'll do it a little bit differently at the ceremony in two particular cases. Moses and Aaron then pick up on the fact that God has improvised within sort of the logic of the ceremony. And both Moses and Aaron end up improvising, and God approves the improvisation. In fact, in one of those cases, God had given Moses directions that were a little bit unclear, and Moses had to improvise. He had to make some decisions on his own as to how to carry out this particular ritual. So in other words, God has created a good world. God had created a good set of rituals, but God is open to improvising or improving those rituals. And God is also open to the idea that Moses and Aaron might do so. Now, not all improvisations or all human suggestions are good. Korach also has a suggestion, and Korach gets killed, snuffed out, burned to death, and buried under the ground. So God doesn't approve all human suggestions, but those are cases where there are at least two cases where God approves Moses and Aaron's improvisations. Also, there are 5 stories in the books of Leviticus and Numbers in which the people ask God a question about a point of law. Moses brings the question to God, and God answers it. In 3 of those 5 stories, the question itself is really a very thinly disguised suggestion. There are 3 stories in which human beings make a suggestion about how this good law maybe could be a little better. And in all 3 of those cases, God responds positively. God doesn't say, my law is perfect. It came out of heaven. I wrote it. There's no way you can improve upon it. In 3 of these cases, God says, it's a good idea. Let's do it your way. So in P, God creates good things, but God is interested in improving them. And God is interested in seeing how the Jewish people can improve on them. And so I think that might be how we should understand this emphasis on the word tov. The issue that concerns P isn't so much good versus evil, but I think that there's a good foundation and things can get a little bit better from there, and human beings can be part of the process of making things a little bit better. And so that's where I don't think that P is interested in theodicy, the question of why does evil exist in the universe? I mean, that's a gigantic question for which I don't think P provides an answer. But I think P's emphasis on good here has to do with laying a foundation, and then things will get a bit better from there with human input.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to take the liberty of summing up for maybe for my own purposes as much as anyone else's, but that I think really on the broadest level. So what you shared with us today was, if we look at the syntax of the opening of Genesis in the context of the literature that was its context, ancient Near Eastern literary culture, we observe the big departure from the norm, which is the absence of the temple created by God for God to live in. And the takeaway there is we have to look ahead to the Mishkan, which, very different from those temples created by gods, is built by us as a manifestation of ongoing partnership, our role as ongoing partners with God in completing and perfecting and improving the world. So, you know, with this theme of liminality, the space in between, it's almost like we're saying, I think what I'm getting from your session is that liminality is kind of a semi-permanent state, at least, you know, it's a long-term state until perhaps messianic times, and it's just a standing charge to us from God to keep working and making the world a better place.
Bidiyuk, exactly. Yeah, beautifully summarized.
Great.
Toda rabah, Julia.
Thank you so much for teaching us today, for kicking off the series once again, and we look forward to having you back soon and to seeing everyone again next week.